Starting off today, some excitement here in Washington, D.C., not to mention New York and all along the eastern coast. An earthquake. Seriously. The U.S. Geological Society says it was the largest earthquake in this region since 1897, when there was also a 5.9 earthquake. This afternoon, it was just before 2 p.m., and within a few seconds of feeling the rumbling of our desks, my colleague Lauren Lister and I did what we practiced so many times as kids growing up in Southern California. We ducked and covered, got under our desks. Now, I think we were more worried watching through the window as some of the construction workers on the scaffolding several floors up had some reason to be freaked out, but it was a kind of a big one still, 5.9. And a lot of people here, they were panicked, confused, full of anxiety. This was a great majority of people here's first earthquake ever. Lauren Lister is now outside on the streets of Washington, D.C., where we all evacuated earlier. And Lauren, it looks like things are back to normal now.
Christine, things are certainly back to normal, but just as you mentioned, about an hour and a half ago, these streets were filled with people. Everyone evacuated because of this earthquake, which, as you and I experienced, both coming from California, is not a rarity. Not so on the East Coast, though. It brought people out of their buildings, evacuated, and it triggered live news coverage breaking away from Libya for hours.
I know, that's really interesting that you mentioned that. If you looked on the television screens here in our newsroom, we have a bunch of them up with all the different channels, a lot of mainstream media networks. People, you know, the networks broke away from what is going to be a historic day, a historic story in Libya to talk about this earthquake, every aspect of it. What did you see and what are you hearing?
Well, I think some of the funniest tidbits, you know, everybody was talking about how this quake has been felt all over the East Coast, from D.C. as far as Detroit up to Toronto. It's definitely rare. You know, we don't want to downplay that. The last time, as you mentioned, that an earthquake of this size was felt in Virginia, which is where the epicenter was back in the 1800s. So it is very rare. At the same time, in New York, it was felt at about a 2.0, which is very low. And they kept breaking into live reports. They kept warning people to not dial 911 unless it was an absolute emergency. That's pretty, you know, standard. And then poor DSK, you know, DSK, not his case was dropped today. The charges were dropped. It was dismissed. But during his news conference, where the attorney was talking about it and making the announcements, talking to the press, it got interrupted by the earthquake, and that totally stole the show from him.
I'm sure he'll be happy to have those cameras pointed in a different direction from him. I know that, speaking of New York, from what I understand, JFK was among the airports shut down. I know some of the air traffic controllers actually had to evacuate buildings, evacuated, and also 2 nuclear power plants. I want to know, are you hearing anything regarding these nuclear power plants, and also what are some of the bigger implications here?
Well, you know, the thing that's interesting is that this is obviously a rare occurrence, but it was a 5.9 earthquake. And we have seen near the epicenter, there is a nuclear power plant in North Anna, which has been shut down, and they're running on generators to cool those rods there. What we're hearing is it's the lowest level of emergency and that everything is under control. But this does bring up the question of earthquakes in this area and the nuclear power plants that are nearby, because I think the bigger picture is that one of the worst nuclear power plants on the federal government's list is just 35 miles from the epicenter, from Midtown Manhattan, just 35 miles away. That's Indian Point. It's a plant that the governor has wanted shut down. It's still there, still running. And remember, so this is a small earthquake now, and they're rare in New York, but if there was to be a larger earthquake, the area that needed to be evacuated in Japan around the Fukushima plant was 50 miles at least. Can you imagine New York trying to evacuate the entire city?
9 million people.
That kind of a disaster.
9 million people on that tiny
happen.
island. Yeah, sounds crazy. Thanks so much, RT correspondent Lauren Lister, on the streets that were much more crowded just a little while ago.